Hello and welcome to a brief lecture on the principles of narration. Narration is most often used in academic writing to convey when an author has some sort of close personal connection to the subject matter being written about. So for instance, say a paper was being written about illegal immigration, and the writer of one of those papers was he or herself at one time an illegal immigrant. Well, then that will give that individual sort of very specific experiences pertaining to that topic, in which case it might be valid to then write about his or her experiences within that paper. And that might call then for the use of narration, which is really just storytelling. So in the case of this particular paper you're writing for this unit, a paper that I call a conflict narrative, the purpose is to use storytelling to convey a lesson learned from the conflict. So as you're thinking about a possible topic for your conflict narrative, I want you to think about things you've experienced over the course of your life that ask you to encounter some sort of personal conflict. And we'll talk about some different types of conflict here later on in the lecture, but this is the starting place for planning and brainstorming on this topic. So, thinking of a story from your own past where you learned a lesson from some kind of conflict that you had to navigate. Within your essay itself, that lesson learned should be conveyed or revealed in your thesis statement. Hopefully you watched the Composition Basics lecture that included basic essay structure in it, showing you where the thesis statement would be, or where it would naturally be placed within a paper in the introduction. At any rate, I wanted to give you an example thesis statement for a conflict narrative. So I just kind of came up with something just made up. A lot of people will write about things that are very stressful and trying in this conflict narrative, as would only seem natural. And one thing that comes up a lot is death of loved ones, of family members, so on and so forth. So here would be an example thesis statement. Through the death of my friend, I learned that the best way to deal with grief was to meet it head on. Okay? That basically conveys that the writer's going to tell you about some sort of arduous or trying experience that he or she went through, but that at the end, the writer was able to take something away from it, and that is now being shared with you, the reader. The audience for all the papers in this class should be thought of on two levels. Obviously, you have to think of me, the instructor, as your audience, and you're trying to appeal and cater to, my way of thinking about what creates a successful writing assignment. But I also want you to think about how this could be written for a more general audience. So a couple of things I want to add on here real quickly are, when you're writing your papers, I don't want you to reference the assignment you're writing for, and I don't want you to reference the class that you're in, because then that strikes this general audience. I want you to imagine almost that this could be published, say, in a magazine or online somewhere. So no statements like, while I was thinking about this assignment for my class, I remembered this time in 4th grade. Nothing like that. Again, no mentioning of the class or the assignment. Instead, your assumption should be that you're just writing this because it's something you want to communicate. All right, so purpose, audience, get those out of the way. Let's talk about how you're actually going to go about structuring this narrative essay. So any narrative, and by narrative I just mean any story, a narrative is a story, necessarily contains plot, and plot is just simply the parts of the story and how they're arranged. What you see here up on the board, this little drawing, is what's known as a plot arc. It's a very traditional kind of structure. They've been used to analyze and understand how plots work for a very long time. And although even the one I posted at the top of this unit. That image you may see on Desire to Learn looks a little different than this one. They all have the same basic elements. This one has 5 elements: exposition, rise in action, complication, climax, and resolution. And when you think about that number 5 parts, also talked in the Composition Basics lecture about 5-paragraph essays, so you can see where these two things go together. Now again, let me just reiterate the fact that 5-paragraph essays are a minimum expectation. In many cases, I think you should exceed that, and I hope you do, even with this first paper as well. So real quickly, what do each one of these 5 things do within the narrative? Well, the exposition is the part that provides background information. In a basic story, let's say a short story, the exposition is going to be the part at the beginning of the story where you get information about the characters and the setting. You can imagine this from movies as well. Say a romantic comedy where in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the movie you kind of see the woman and how she is in her daily life, and you see the guy and how he is in his daily life. And then, after that, really the story begins. And that's what I mean here in Rise in Action, that is the actual beginning of the story. It's where the main thread of action that this story is going to be about begins. So what that means is, if you can imagine, an introduction for this paper is about, this time that this friend of yours passed away. And then when you get into the first body paragraph, it might say something like, I was on my way to school on a Tuesday morning when I got a phone call. And bang, that's the beginning of the story, right? Because now you've actually entered into a timeline, you've referenced a day and what was going on, and so that moment then is the rise in action. Somewhere on the way up this incline towards the climax here, we experience what is known as the complication. This is a very important, very significant aspect of the plot structure, because essentially it is the introduction of conflict. Now, conflict, in my estimation, is the most important thing in any story. It's the whole purpose for stories. You're writing a conflict narrative in the case of this unit, but if you think about it, every narrative, every story ever told revolves around conflict. It's all about conflict. I don't care if it's an action movie, a romantic movie, a comedy. I don't care if it's a 30-minute sitcom. What happens on every episode of every single sitcom? Well, the characters in that show, encounter some new conflict between them, and they work to resolve it. It's always, always there. And we'll talk about conflict here a little bit more in a minute. But let's just proceed on our way. We've gone through exposition, rise in action, complication, and then climax. Climax is often a little bit misunderstood. People think of it as, the point of highest action, where the most is going on, say in an action movie where like the coolest explosions are happening. And that's understandable that we think of it that way. But again, because conflict is so important, the definition of climax is actually tied to conflict as well. The conflict is resolved. So it's that moment when whatever the conflict is, it has finally been in some way defeated or otherwise resolved by the characters in the story. Finally, we have resolution. Resolution appears in stories on different levels. Sometimes there's a lot of it, sometimes there's not very much of it. It's basically the aftermath of the story. After the conflict has been resolved, what do you see? One real kind of conventional type of resolution everybody would be familiar with would be in, say, a romantic comedy, where after the climax, once the couple's finally together, then it fades out and it fades back in, and it says like 6 months later, and it shows them and they're on their honeymoon, or shows them 2 years later and they've got kids, and but they're happy, things like that. That's what we're talking about when we talk about resolution. Obviously, you should be thinking exposition equals introduction, resolution equals conclusion, rise in action, complication, climax, body paragraphs. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about conflict, because it's so important. Obviously, this is a conflict narrative, so you need to be thinking about okay, what are some types of conflict, or from my own personal history, when have I had conflict? I know sometimes for my younger students that they even have trouble identifying this at first, because when you think about conflict, you're always thinking about person versus person. Sometimes people will say, well, geez, I've always gotten along with my family, I've never really had any problems with people at school, I just don't feel like I've had any conflict. But more than likely you have, and this offers you some different ways to think about it. First of all, let's identify the fact that there are two basic kinds of conflict. There's external and there's internal. External conflict meaning any type of conflict you would have with created by a source outside of yourself. Internal conflict coming from within. And that's why I think everybody has experienced real conflict, because we've all experienced this person versus self. It's so important to understanding who we are as individuals, how stories work, and how conflict works. Because almost any time you're having a conflict with another person, you're also having a conflict with yourself. Unless you operate on some level of confidence and or denial, it's unlikely that you never experience self-doubt or self-loathing, or just moments of uncertainty about what you're doing, whether or not you're making the right decision, so on and so forth. But the list over here says person versus self versus society. This can come in lots of ways. Sexism, classism, racism, things of that nature, the way, the educational system may have held you back or something like that. Person versus nature. In this day and age, in this country, a lot of us don't have personal struggles with nature, but I don't know if you have gone through a really bad storm, a tornado, flood, something like that. Maybe you have a story there. Person versus technology. I think that, is increasingly familiar to a lot of us, moments where we've needed technology to come through for us in some important way, and it just hasn't been there. And then finally, the supernatural, if you want to let loose with your strange experiences with aliens or ghosts or something of that ilk, then here's your opportunity to. I should say, with this conflict narrative, please do keep in mind that while these essays are written and submitted to me with confidentiality, please don't incriminate yourselves in any way on any of the assignments in this class. If you need to, obviously you're going to have to convey some personal things in this, and again, you will have complete confidentiality, unless, your conflict narrative is about the time, like, you held up the Hucks over there while you were on drugs or something like that, and you got away with it. Because then I'm going to have to, obviously turn you in. So just keep that in mind. All right, we've covered purpose, audience, the structure of a conflict narrative, types of conflict, a couple other things to think about. It says organic versus formulaic. All right, I've shown you something sort of formulaic here, and with all the essays in English 101, I like to give my students a formula, a way forward structurally, organizationally, so that you know what my expectations are, and you can write a paper that works just like this. Organic, though, to me would imply that a lot of students, a lot of writers, like to feel their own way through a paper and the way it should be. And I respect that, and if you have a different way you want to do this, then I want to give you the room to experiment and to come up with that more organic structure that's unique to you, that's maybe more original, but it's also going to incur more risk, right? Because it might not work, whereas this is sort of tried and true. One real easy way to make your structure more organic would be to use something like flashbacks, right? Flashbacks are used in storytelling to break up this linear one-way flow through time. So instead of always moving forward, you have little points where it moves back on itself into the past. So that would be one example of how you could do something a little different with the structure. Couple do's, couple don'ts. This is one paper in this class where you can use first person. I, me, we, us, all that is permitted here. It will not always be permitted, and I will let you know when it's not, but it's important that you start to distinguish between first person and third person and when it's appropriate and when it's not. You necessarily do need to use dialogue. All narratives are funner to read and more engaging for readers when you use dialogue. By dialogue, I mean a conversation between at least two individuals where you use quotation marks and all that stuff. I don't have any examples of that up on here. If you go to page 667 in the Wadsworth Handbook, there's a whole chapter that, I believe it's chapter 56, that covers how to do that kind of stuff. So you can get the nuts and bolts right out of the textbook. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me or contact me otherwise. You could post a question to the Ask a Question forum as well. Don'ts. One of the risks of using first person is that sometimes students get into a rut where they begin every sentence with I. Or maybe not even every sentence, but a lot of sentences with I. I did this, then I did that. I did this, then I did that. So just be aware of that. It creates a really monotonous style to your writing that seems, not very sophisticated and certainly not at the college level. The one final thing is don't tell a story without conflict. Stories without conflicts are very boring, they're flat, and they seem a lot of times without purpose because the purpose here is to convey a lesson learned. Well, if you didn't go through some kind of conflict, then it's going to be really hard to create a thesis. So it's important right from the very beginning that you make a good choice about that topic that you want to write about some moment of conflict you experienced in your life. And remember again that if you can't think of a lot of external conflict examples from your life, I bet you can think of some internal conflict examples. Think too of places where we commonly experience conflict: at school, at home, at work, places that really tend to lend themselves to conflict. I get a lot of stories from family vacations, oddly enough. We think of family vacations as these, these getaways and these great times, but when we're away from home, a lot of times things will go awry. So you might find some material there. That's all I've got for now. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.